The Dickensian Disability Movement. There was an entirely separate and very different disability movement that ran its course more than a century ago. It was a largely private sector effort led as often as not by elite college-educated women whose primary cause was what they called crippled children. A mighty wave of organization building, professional work, and advocacy eventually emerged, practically all of which reflected the movement's elite private sector origins. In some respects, it was not unlike the way that Charles Dickens Ebenezer Scrooge, in the aftermath of his Christmas Eve reformation, gave aid to Tiny Tim's family so that the child, quote, did not die, as the story puts it, and for that reason I have dubbed this the Dickensian Disability Movement. It began in the 1860s, with a flurry of new entities intended to provide, for the first time in the United States, some level of medical and social support for people with disabilities living in the general population. Groups like the New York Society for the Relief of the Ruptured and Crippled, the ancestor of today's Hospital for Special Surgery. These groups appeared in response to a crisis, throngs, as one contemporary put it, of poor, homeless, unemployed people with disabilities. Hospitals would not admit them since they were chronically rather than acutely ill. Unable to find work, they became professional beggars, graphically displaying their ailments to earn their alms. And they had to, in order to compete with thousands of other beggars, all hoping for scraps in the physically dismal, filthy city as it then existed. Through different combinations of health care, education, shelter, and what we would now call social work, the organizations of the 1860s managed to push back to some degree against these brutal circumstances. May Dara, for one, may have had her life saved by these early groups. She reached adulthood with the talent and drive to catalyze the movement's next phase, a proliferation of charitable groups, the creation of the first ever public and private educational programs for children with disabilities. What's more, once the cause of crippled children had become acceptable, thanks to Dara and others, elites responded in increasingly substantial ways. The Dickensian movement reached its peak during the 19-teens. Institutions multiplied across the nation. National and professional journals were established. Summer camps appeared, and occupational therapy became a recognized discipline. Ford Motors was hiring people with disabilities. Even Major League Baseball had a share of players with disabilities. As World War I approached, the Dickensians took a proactive position, establishing the incredibly active and prolific Red Cross Institute for Crippled and Disabled Men, among other things, to prepare for the expected flood of disabled veterans. But as the progressive era faded during the 1920s, the Dickensian movement sputtered and lost its reforming zeal. It was from this incomplete fabric, out of the ashes of the Dickensian era, that what we now call the medical model emerged. Ironically, it's probably the Dickensians' most obvious legacy. Beyond question, the Dickensians produced a leadership, an institutional network, a literature, a base of social work and social policy that was unprecedented. It is, however, less clear whether these benefactors actually saw people with disabilities as human beings like themselves. It's hard to dispute that even impersonal or patronizing support was an advance over begging and dying on the street. Nonetheless, the ties of common humanity between disabled and non-disabled could not advance so long as the disability community remained passive rather than proactive, so long as the Dickensian disability movement served as a mirror of the benefactor's moral goodness rather than as an exercise in self-advocacy by people with disabilities themselves. And the proof of this lies in the fact that over the entire course of the Dickensian disability movement, more than half a century, it seems to have produced only a handful of disability activists, people like May Dara. During the 50-year period of the Dickensian disability movement, the population of people with disabilities grew because of improved public health and medical care, because of the Great War, because of increasing rates of industrial injuries, and because of the sudden emergence of polio as a major public health issue. Thanks to the public school programs that May Dara and others had developed, many young people with disabilities received at least some portion of an education. But they hit an almost absolute wall when it came to economic independence and social autonomy. This proved to be an obstacle that would not be successfully attacked for nearly 50 years by the founders of the modern New York City disability rights movement. Today's movement rests on an entirely different foundation. It is primarily the result of self-advocacy by people with disabilities, and it rests on a legalistic and publicly funded basis that is quite unlike the elitist, charitable, and moralistic foundation of its Dickensian predecessor.